Hello, I'm Shannon Tiesi from the Diplomat, and I'm here today at the American Enterprise Institute, where I'm happy to join Sadanand Dhume. He is a resident fellow here at AEI and is also a columnist on South Asia for the Wall Street Journal. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
India is going through a political sea change as the BJP has regained control of the country for the first time in a decade. The new Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, is something of a mystery when it comes to foreign policy, and Mr. Dhume will be helping us to explore Modi's foreign policy movements thus far in his term. Mr. Modi has been elected into office mostly for his economic promises. He wants to get India back on track economically. Is this really the crux of his foreign policy initiatives so far?
I would say that he's been elected for two things. You're right that the most important was to put India's economy back on track. But the second really is foreign policy related, because he was elected to create the idea of a strong India, of a resurgent India, and that has not just like an economic component but also a security component. And so, yes, to answer your question, the economy is going to be absolutely central to his foreign policy, but no, it won't be a foreign policy that is dominated exclusively by the economy.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that people want to have Modi shape India's foreign policy in a way that makes it seem stronger, that might have the correlation of him wanting to act tough when it comes to some of these longer entrenched issues in India-Pakistan relations, India-China relations. Are we seeing any indications that Modi is taking a hardline stance on these long-standing issues?
Well, you're not seeing indications of a hardline stance, but you certainly are seeing indications of a leader who cares a lot about his neighborhood. His first visit was to Bhutan. His second visit, which is very successful, was to Nepal, which just wrapped up. And so this is someone who is very keenly aware of India's periphery. And of course, there's an economic element to this. If India's own region prospers with more trade and economic interaction, it's of course good for India's economy, but it's also good for India's security. I think that the toughness we're going to see is if and when India is tested. So the most obvious examples of that would be that if there is a major terrorist attack that is traced to Pakistan, or if there's another major territorial incursion by China, then I think you are going to likely see a tougher response from this government than from the previous one.
And how would he balance that inclination with the equally urgent need to maintain stable economic relations with these neighbors?
I think it's not either or. I think his calculation and I think his effort would likely be to ensure that there is no provocation. But if there is a provocation, I imagine that security interests will be paramount and will not necessarily take a back seat to immediate economic issues.
You mentioned that Modi has gone out of his way to emphasize relations with India's neighbors, including Bhutan and Nepal, but he also invited all the regional leaders, including the Prime Minister of Pakistan, to his swearing-in. Do you think this signals that Modi is trying to put India in a position of unquestioned regional leadership? Is that what we should make of this outreach?
I think part of it is leadership, but I think it is also simply extending a hand of partnership to all the neighbors. I think it was a gesture that was received very well in the neighboring countries, particularly in Pakistan and Sri Lanka. So it's a bit of both. It's sort of that, here is the coronation of Modi, who has been swept into office with this massive mandate. And so everyone has come to that historic occasion. But it's more than that. It's also about India saying that it wants to have good neighborly relations. It wants to privilege trade and economic ties with its neighbors, and it hopes that its neighbors will meet it halfway.
Mm-hmm. And one of the neighbors that everyone is most interested in would be China. Obviously, there's strong reasons on both sides for further economic cooperation. Both countries would like to see their trade growing. But there's also been more and more talk, at least from the Chinese side, on more strategic cooperation, for example, on ensuring Afghanistan's security at the post-NATO withdrawal in 2014. Do you think we're going to see more security strategic cooperation between Modi's government and Xi Jinping's government in Beijing?
Specifically on Afghanistan or more generally?
More generally.
So I haven't seen any evidence of that. And in fact, I would argue that the broad contours of India's China policy have not changed dramatically. I think that there is an interest in India not to unnecessarily antagonize China. There is an interest in maintaining a strong economic relationship with China, and in part for that to act as an incentive to prevent China from doing anything precipitate. But at the same time, there are genuine concerns about China, particularly on the border. So I don't think that any Indian government, that essential mix doesn't change. With the Modi government, you're going to see stepped up economic engagement because the economy is so central to his worldview. But at the same time, this is someone who has been elected to lead India in a no-nonsense, robust manner. So I think there isn't going to be much tolerance for the kind of territorial incursions, for instance, we saw last year.
You know, India has historically enjoyed fairly close ties with Russia, and now Russia is currently, its relationship with the West is rapidly deteriorating, and Russia is drawing closer to China. What is India's current take on the Russian situation? Is it still trying to keep that historical relationship? Is it trying to draw closer? Is it trying to draw further away? What do you think is Modi's game plan?
I think India is trying to walk a fine line. It certainly doesn't want to jeopardize its relationship with Russia, which sort of comes down to a very important arms relationship. That's the single most important thing. But also, I think historically Indians have felt that the Russian veto at the UN Security Council has been important to India. So what India would love to see is for this whole problem to go away, because of course it also has a very close relationship with the United States and with the West. But if people are wondering whether India will turn against Russia because of events in Ukraine, I think that's extremely unlikely to happen.
There's been some speculation that Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping would like to sort of convince India to join with them in an anti-U.S., anti-West coalition that stretches across Asia and Eurasia. Do you think that Modi would have any interest in joining this sort of new bloc?
I think it's too early to say definitively. My own hunch is no. I think it would be very foolish for India to join any such anti-Western bloc, because much more so than either Russia or China, India's own rise and India's own success is really tied in many ways to the West. So the idea of BRICS as something that gives India a greater say in global affairs is really quite harmless. But the idea of a BRICS that's driven by Russia and China to take this anti-Western agenda would be quite harmful for India. And I would hope that the Modi government has nothing to do with that.
So let's expand a little bit more on what Modi sees as the potential for India's relationship with the West, particularly with the U.S. Modi is scheduled to visit the U.S. later this year. What do you think his goals are for that first high-level diplomacy while he's in Washington?
I think the interesting thing here is that Modi has taken a very pragmatic view. He hasn't allowed the fact that he was denied a visa to the United States from 2005 all the way now till 2014 to get in the way of what he sees as India's own national interest, which is to have a close and cooperative relationship with the U.S. I'm not sure how much that the two countries are going to achieve in concrete terms between now and September. It's certainly the case that India's scuttling of the WTO agreement reached in Bali last year has raised some concerns about how far the two countries can go together on the economic side. But I'd say it's still early days, and let's see how things pan out over the next few weeks and months.
And on the U.S. side, do you think we're seeing a more concerted effort to reach out to India in particular, especially after the fiasco with the Indian diplomat being detained in New York last year?
Yeah, I think in the U.S. there's a broad sense, and I think it's a correct sense, that this is an opportunity to press a reset button, so to speak. That you have a new government, it's a government that's been elected with an overwhelming mandate. It has a bias for action. We saw a lot of stagnation in the previous government. And so the U.S., I think, has rightly seen that this is a good moment to let bygones be bygones and try to build relations with the new government, with the new Prime Minister and his team. And so even if everything does not necessarily come to fruition immediately, I think the instinct on this is correct.
And let's finish where we began by talking about Modi's economic goals for his foreign policy. How do you think the success or perhaps the failure of Modi's ambitious economic agenda is going to tie into his foreign policy decision making?
Most profoundly. I mean, essentially, Modi is going to be judged as a success based on whether he gets India's economy back to the close to double-digit growth rates that it had enjoyed until a few years ago. If he can do that, all of the major foreign policy and defense policy challenges that India face begin to shrink and become more manageable. If he is unable to revive the economy, the foreign policy and security challenges will loom larger and larger and be difficult for him to handle.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have, but thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks for tuning in. Once again, I'm Shannon Tiezi from The Diplomat.